So good morning and welcome to the Amaero International Investor Webinar. I'm Jane Morgan, the Investor and Media Relations Manager, and today I'm joined by our Executive Chairman and CEO, Hank Holland. We'll be running through today's presentation followed by a Q&A session. So to ask a question throughout today's webinar, please use the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of the screen. Hank, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane. A bit more than 5 months ago, on March 26th, Amaero disclosed it had signed a binding offtake and preferred supplier agreement that was conditional upon achieving qualification of C103 in accordance with the counterparty's specifications. Given the competitive market dynamics with a single U.S. domestic producer of C103, the counterparty was not disclosed. However, the counterparty was described as a leading and deeply resourced additive manufacturer of C103 and refractory alloys for the defense and space industry. The company has industry-leading technical and applied research capabilities, operating out of multiple locations in the United States, and collaborates with the U.S. Department of Defense funded laboratories, as well as prime defense contractors. At the time of the announcement, the company provided guidance for 3 important milestones. Number 1, we expected to commission the first atomizer by June the 30th. Number 2, we expected to ship C103 powder to the counterparty for testing before September 30th. And number 3, we expected to complete qualification of C103 in accordance with the counterparty's specifications before December 31. Amaero was pleased to announce this morning that we have completed qualification of C103 with Adman Group. This is a seminal milestone for the company, and we have achieved the milestone well ahead of schedule. Given the significance of the announcement, we want to share some commentary on the milestone, review the thematic opportunity for Amaero, and preview the milestones ahead. I'll spend a bit more time on the front part of this presentation and then move a bit more quickly in the back. As mentioned, this is a culminating event, and as I stated in the announcement, since I assumed the role of Chairman and CEO in October of 2022, we've taken bold and decisive actions to position Amaero as a leading U.S. domestic producer of C103 refractory and titanium alloy AM powder. In order for additive manufacturing to achieve its potential, it's imperative that we create a more resilient, more scalable, and more responsive U.S. domestic supply chain for C103 and specialty alloy AM powder, and time is of the essence. Achieving qualification of C103 with Adman Group and Castheon is a validating and transformative milestone. This strategic collaboration will play a crucial role in demonstrating manufacturing readiness and advancing the integration of advanced additive manufacturing into the most vital and critical defense and space applications. The agreement between Adman Group and Amaero aligns leading organizations dedicated to advancing the commercial viability and adoption of additive manufacturing. This collaboration brings together Amaero's pioneering expertise in powder metallurgy and cutting-edge atomization technology with Castheon and Dr. Yuping Gao's industry-leading innovations in material science and additive manufacturing, and with CAM's advanced manufacturing processes and scalable production capability. We look forward to collaborating with Adman to advance manufacturing readiness levels, technical readiness levels, and to enable broad insertion of metal additive manufacturing to support the Department of Defense, DoD-funded laboratories, and defense prime contractors, and to progress hypersonic and strategic missile platforms from development and demonstration phases to serial production. As these programs are highly strategic, generational investments, and as the programs are critical to national security, Amaero and Adman are committed to prioritizing the DoD, its laboratories, and defense prime contractors. As it relates to the ASX announcement, highlights include Amaero has completed qualification of C103 AM powder and has disclosed Adman Group and its subsidiary Castheon as the counterparty. Achieving qualification positions Amaero as the largest capacity and most responsive U.S. domestic producer of C103 refractory and specialty alloy powder for additive manufacturing. The qualification triggers Adman's offtake obligation for 2.25 tons of C103 AM powder, with 0.25 tons expected to ship by the end of the calendar year, Another 2 tons expected to ship in calendar year 2025. Most importantly, the qualification commences a 5-year preferred supplier agreement whereby Amaero will be the primary supplier of C103 refractory and specialty alloy powder to Adman Group and all of its subsidiaries, including Castillon and recently acquired Kozlowski Advanced Manufacturing, or CAM. The combination of Castillon and CAM creates the largest metal additive manufacturer in the United States, with 50 plus 3D printing machines and 300,000 square feet of production. Expected future sales are material to Amaero's revenue, and moreover, the attributable revenue is a key assumption underpinning Amaero expectation that it will achieve EBITDA breakeven in fiscal year 26. Concurrent with disclosing the binding offtake and preferred supplier agreement in March, Amaero also announced a $20 million institutional capital raise. As subsequently announced by the investor, Fidelity International anchored the capital raise with a $20 million investment. Amaero had cornerstone support from 2 other well-respected institutional funds. As referenced in earlier remarks, we gave specific guidance on 3 important milestones, and each of these milestones was delivered ahead of schedule, as you see on this page. We had guided we'd complete commission of the atomizer by June 30. We completed in early June. We guided that we would ship C103 powder for testing by September 30. We shipped in late July. And we guided that we'd complete qualification of C103 by December 31, and we completed in early September. The accomplishment is a testament to Amaero's technical and manufacturing team, led by Eric Bono, and including Fred Yolton, Dr. Dave Schmidt, Jay Chandran, Dr. Arun, Sandy Awood, Tanner Nielsen, Dr. Ron Aman, and the rest of the Amaero team. I've said before, and I'll state again, the most significant achievement was attracting and building our team. I would also add the remarkable achievement in qualifying C103 in such a truncated timeline underscores our collaborative relationship with Adman. Unlike many industrial companies that have dispersed business units, Amaero and Adman are solely focused on advancing the adoption of additive manufacturing and advancing applied research for advanced materials and additive manufacturing. As Amaero has demonstrated, we are committed to move with a sense of urgency, to improve the resiliency and the scalability of the industrial-based capabilities and the necessary supply chain to support vital programs in the defense and space sectors. Looking ahead, with qualification achieved, we immediately turn our attention to milestones on the horizon. Over the remainder of fiscal year 2025, the team will be advancing a series of initiatives in parallel. As it relates to commercial sales and business development, we expect to commence commercial sales in the March quarter, and we expect to secure additional offtake agreements. I would add that I see many small cap ASX businesses that announce a series of LOIs, MOUs, and commercial agreements, yet they have no immediate prospects for revenue. Intentionally, Amaero takes a different approach. We strive to communicate in a transparent and balanced manner, and we only disclose agreements once there are binding agreements with a prospect of demonstrable near-term revenue. We expect that FY25 will be the year that we begin to scale revenue. We also expect to announce commercial contracts for isostatic powder processing manufacturing, or IPP, and to deliver multi-ton IPP manufactured parts. As it relates to the facility, we will continue to manage expenses judiciously and to delay the outlay of expenses where possible. We expect to complete the improvements near year-end fiscal year 25. As it relates to non-dilutive funding opportunities, we've been working for some time on U.S. federal grants and asset-backed debt financing. We would expect to secure a first federal grant in fiscal year 25 and expect to source debt financing near the end of fiscal year 25. Importantly, as it relates to ongoing collaborations, we will continue to work closely with Dr. Yuping Gao and his technical team to make advances in C103 and refractory alloy powders. And we will advance active collaborations with DoD-funded laboratories to atomize development alloys and to make advances in additive manufacturing and IPP manufacturing. Lastly, before turning to Amaero and the thematic opportunity, let me provide an overview of the supply chain for C103 and specialty alloy powders, as well as for additive manufacturing and IPP manufacturing. Amaero's strategy has been to address critical gaps in the supply chain for the defense and space sectors. Beginning upstream, C103 is comprised of 89% niobium, 10% hafnium, and 1% titanium. As niobium is primarily mined in Brazil and hafnium is mined in North America, we are not reliant on minerals that are primarily sourced in China or Russia. At the same time, the US and its allies have a dearth of melt cast and forge capacity. Given the national priority to expand capacity for melt cast forge, we feel there's an opportunity to vertically integrate feedstock production over time. Moving to powder production, C103 and refractory alloys have very high melting temperatures, and as such, only the electrode induction gas atomization, or EIGA technology, is well suited to qualify C103 powder and to produce in scale. In the US, there's only one other domestic producer with EIGA technology. The other producer is a world-class integrated material business. It's a listed company in the US with a US $7+ billion market cap and US $4 billion+ in revenue. The business is primarily focused on raw materials such as sheet, bar, and tubing, with powder accounting less than 5% of its revenue. As for Tier 1 additive manufacturers, the combination of Castillon and CAM creates the largest additive manufacturer in the US with 50+ 3D printing machines and, as mentioned, 300,000 square feet of production space. Castillon and Dr. Gao have led pioneering research relating to C103 and refractory alloys and 3D printing parameters. Meanwhile, CAM has advanced serial production process and is well suited for scalable production. Separately, in the area of isostatic powder processing, or IPP manufacturing, the Amaero team has 3 decades of pioneering experience, and there's only one other established competitor in the US. Given the long lead times for large castings and forgings, there is a significant opportunity for IPP, in particular in the submarine industrial base. Finally, turning to the end customers, which are defense primes such as Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, RTX, and Honeywell, and the US Department of Defense military branches that include Air Force, Army, and Navy. Lastly, let me turn to the demand signal before we'll begin to pick up the pace and move through the thematic part of the opportunity. As we disclosed back in February of this year, Amaero retained Fairmont Consulting Group, one of the better established US domestic consulting firms focused on the defense sector. Fairmont did an exhaustive study that looked at all high temperature materials for 4 primary verticals. The verticals of hypersonics, strategic missiles, space launch, and satellites, each of which has the requirement of thermal protection and or propulsion systems that require high temperature materials. As you see on this page, the top line denotes all high temperature materials. The dotted green line in the middle is C103 in all forms. And you'll notice as you look at calendar year or fiscal year 23 at the bottom and fiscal year 24, much of the C103 in current use is in wrought form. By the way, C103 goes back some 6 decades to the Apollo lunar landing vehicle. We've got 6 decades of decades. It's been well established in space applications and thus is being introduced in these defense platforms we described. The bottom solid green denotes C103 powder. And as you see on the right-hand side with the insertion of additive manufacturing, and you see a kink in the curve in fiscal year 25 in particular, powder C103 is anticipated to grow at a compounded annual growth rate of 62% a year. The expectation is that demand in fiscal year 28 will be approximately 105 tons per year. We expect further growth from that, with demand plateauing somewhere north of 120 tons or so. I would add as a commentary, we do not feel that there is much risk in these final demand. These programs are well established. As an example, in the case of hypersonics, the US is funding many of these platforms, given the urgent need to secure an offensive and defensive capability, given that China and Russia both currently have weapon systems. What I would say is if there is a risk, it's more so the timing. We're dealing with the government programs, and quite often you could see some of this demand later. And so I think it's reasonable to underscore there could be a risk that could 105 tons occur in 29, not in 28. Could we plateau at 100 or 125 tons, not in 29, but or 30? Certainly we could. But we feel quite strongly that the estimates are conservative as far as final demand. Next section, please, Jane. Let me transition, if I may, now, and I'll move a bit quickly, more quickly, that is, but to touch a bit about Amaero today, and then a bit about the thematic opportunity that we're so excited about, and really explains why we've strategically positioned Amaero the way that we have. Amaero, again, very intentionally, is a singularly focused business. We are an advanced material business focused on producing high-value, refractory, specialty, and titanium alloy powder for additive manufacturing and for mission-critical components, particularly in defense and space. And I would add, we are a US domestic producer, which is particularly important for many of these programs. If you look at our business, there's primarily three pillars, with specialty metal powder production, the top of this page, accounting for on the order of, we would expect 85 to 90% of our revenue. So dominated by an expertise and a very, very strong technical and operating team in specialty metal powders with our advanced IGA technology. On the bottom left side, the team, though, also brings 3 decades of experience. This is numerical modeling, as well as powder metallurgy experience. For IPP, or isostatic powder processing, these are manufactured parts out of powder under very high pressure and very high temperature. And the benefit of this modality is that you get metal properties better than large castings and on par with large forgings. And yet we have a dearth of capability today in the aftermath of the Ukraine conflict and large forgings. So as I mentioned, this is particularly well suited for the submarine industrial base buildup that we have ongoing in the US and allied countries. And then finally, the bottom right, this will not be a particularly large part of our revenues, and yet we view it as a very important part of the business. We've purposely structured our production to be highly responsive to demand pull. Today, as you may know, if you place an order for C103 powder, the wait time is 18, 24 months in some cases. And yet the DoD-funded labs and our tier 1 suppliers and our defense primes are in desperate need to advance programs from development to demonstration, have data feedback, which requires material. It requires powder, as an example, as well as development alloys, and then to quickly progress these into serial production. So this is an area that we feel that we can be a partner of choice with both DoD-funded labs as well as defense primes, and position ourselves very uniquely within the ecosystem. Over the last 12 months, we have moved decisively and we have moved boldly, and primarily making 3 strategic decisions. The first of which was to relocate the business from Australia to Tennessee in the US. This enabled us to hire what I feel is the leading powder metallurgy, powder production team in the US from a technical and manufacturing experience standpoint. And then importantly, to focus not on commodity alloy powders, not even on titanium alloy powder, which is the highest value for most producers, but on specialty alloy powders. Very important decision that we made early on was to relocate the business from Melbourne, Australia to the US. When I invested in this business in May of 2022, the business plan was to install a single atomizer, produce titanium alloy in Melbourne. The gross revenue potential of that business was about $30 million Australian. That was the gross potential revenue of that business that we stepped into in May of 2022. Since announcing that we will be in the US, since attracted and really receiving a pull demand, if you will, for specialty. The business today, we've announced that we plan to install 4 atomizers, the first of which we've already commissioned, you see in the top left of this picture, and a far, far greater potential revenue by many multiples than was the opportunity in Australia. When we moved to the US, not only did we move being driven by the large end market, but we also found a building that was being completed. This saved us 2 years from a go-to-market strategy standpoint, 100,000 square foot building. It also saved us significant risk associated with a build-to-suit. And moreover, we signed a 10-year subsidized electricity agreement at 5.8 US cents a kilowatt hour, or about 9 cents Australian a kilowatt hour. That is less than a third of the US national average and positions us very well as a low-cost producer in the US. Because of being in the US, it allowed us to attract a very strong executive team. Let me touch first on this page with the directors and then go on to the next page on the executive team. We recently also announced, since announcing, by the way, the binding offtake agreement in March, that retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster has joined Amaero as a special advisor to myself. In this role, we work closely and he will advise myself and the executive team on the board on strategic and commercial matters, as well as advising Amaero on its engagement with the US and government, Department of Defense, DoD-funded labs, and defense primes. H.R. McMaster is universally respected. For those in Australia that might not have the perspective, he's universally respected in the US on both sides of the political aisle, in the White House, in the Pentagon, in the private sector, and we're very, very, very fortunate to have his voice now advising me and the board. I would also add, as you see on the bottom of this page, we've really thought forward, if you will, in anticipation of the growth of this business, in anticipation of our other capital market options we may pursue in the future. And we have a very strong and very experienced board of directors at Amaero. I commented before, and I'll reiterate it yet again. I think this is probably the most significant thing that we have done since I joined Amaero. Anchored by Eric Bono, who has 3 decades of experience in powder metallurgy. During that time, by the way, he was mentored, much of it, for Fred Yulton, the third person you see here, who is credited with inventing gas atomization for titanium. He's worked for decades with Dave Schmidt, one of the foremost experts in computational fluid dynamics and numerical modeling. Dr. Ron Amon is leading our effort in IPP. Chris Scanlon, who has prior experience as a CFO at listed companies. And Jay Chandran, who's got remarkable experience standing up greenfield manufacturing operations and has been instrumental as we've achieved what we've achieved at our facility with the build out and the operations. It's very intentional that we focused on the specialty markets. As I mentioned, when I first invested in Amaero, the intent was to focus on titanium. Titanium is an interesting market. There's a shortage of US domestic production, but moreover, as you see on the right-hand side of this page, if you look at the estimated powder prices, notice that titanium has a price about 5 times higher than stainless steel. And then notice on the left side of this page that most of the powder market is comprised of commodity alloys, with stainless steel comprising about 60% of the market, and then nickels, titanium only being about 12% of the market, and then other specialties about 3%. What's so interesting about niobium C103 powder, as you notice again at the estimated prices, notice that albeit titanium has a price 5 times higher than stainless, C103 has a price 20 times higher than titanium. And again, we have one of the only technologies capable of qualifying and producing C103 at scale. Let me move on and touch of the thematic and the secular opportunity, if I may. As you're probably well aware, and to my knowledge, we are the only ASX listed company that sits at the nexus of the 3 pillars that the US national priorities have announced as their primary objectives, the leading national priorities, if you will, to reshore these industrial-based capabilities, led by critical minerals and advanced materials, manufacturing, in particular advanced manufacturing, and defense production and supply chain. We're witnessing in the US a focus on reshoring these capabilities and buttressing the industrial base capabilities, not unlike what we saw in the early 40s, in the early days of World War II. And moreover, today, as I mentioned, we have a sole US producer of C103. In order to insert a new technology such as additive manufacturing, it's a predicate condition that we establish redundancy in US domestic supply chain. And by Amaero becoming the second supplier of C103, it advances what is known as manufacturing readiness level, which is very important. As I mentioned, and this is not hyperbole, there's a wonderful book actually that is behind me called The Arsenal of Democracy. There's another great book called Freedom's Forge, and it's about the buildup in the US of industrial base capabilities in 1939 through 1945. Remarkably, the US in 1939 was the 27th largest manufacturing power in the world. That is the 27th largest manufacturing capability. We had essentially no aviation or bomber manufacturing capability in the US at that time. Before the end of the war, in 1944, the US was producing one bomber an hour, from 0 to 1 bomber an hour, and thus credited with winning World War II, given the stand-up of this industrial base capabilities. Unfortunately, what we've seen in recent decades is we've hollowed out this industrial base capabilities. As you see on the bottom of this page, we've gone from over 6,000 foundries after World War II. Today, we have fewer than 2,000 still producing in the US. We've gone from overall output of steel castings from over 2 million tons to barely over 1 million tons. And likewise, it has become more evident since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some of the critical industrial base capabilities that we have an absolute dearth of. By way of example, Boeing, one of the great manufacturers in the world, and the #1 exporter in the US, I might add, was sourcing over 80% of all of its forgings, such as landing gears for 747s, from a company called VSMPO in Russia. A remarkable statistic if you think about it. And the US today has a dearth, an absolute dearth of casting and forging capability. You see, as it relates to castings and forgings on this page, and notice the second bullet point, the US Department of Defense has prioritized casting and forgings as one of 4 focus areas posing a national security threat. Again, this dearth of critical industrial base capabilities. This is essentially the primary thematic play that Amaero is focused on, is reshoring these industrial base capabilities with very strong federal support. Not only do we have federal support from a manufacturing standpoint that is buttressing the industrial base capabilities, but in the US, as you're well aware, we're also in the midst of an election year. And one of the #1 topics, bipartisan support, is to buttress yet again and rebuild and reestablish the manufacturing economy in the US, which of course have very good manufacturing jobs attached to it. Excuse me, what you see here is over the past 20 plus years, in the US, we've seen a 25% decline of manufacturing jobs. By the way, that what we call the Rust Belt in the US, that is states such as Pennsylvania, Indiana, Ohio, the same with Tennessee, the same with Georgia, the same with Alabama and North Carolina. These are the states that have really been hit the hardest and hollowed out as we've lost these jobs. The same theme, by the way, you see on the bottom of this page is played out at our Western allies around the world as we've all collectively relocated these jobs largely to China. Again, on the bipartisan support, you will hear this in many of the ads that are played frequently today in the support of the presidential candidates, again, on both sides of the aisle, be it Democrat or Republican. And you see the recent annual growth of manufacturing jobs, again, very, very good, skilled, high-paying jobs in the US, and bipartisan support of this that we would expect regardless of who wins this presidential election. Finally, for additive, another big secular theme. In the case of metal additive manufacturing, we have reached that tipping point. No longer are we at what might be called version 1.0, where you had significant failure rates, where you had unsophisticated software, where you had small volumes that you could print, and where you had one or two or a small number of lasers, and thus the printing process itself was much, much slower. Look at the bottom quote on this page, if you will, from GE Aviation. It talks about using a digital additive manufacturing, whereby an engine that heretofore, a helicopter engine that heretofore had 900 parts, was printed in 16 parts. Obviously, this greatly reduces the assembly. It greatly reduces the points of failure. It's 40% lighter, and it is 60% cheaper. Moreover, if you see on the right-hand side, and this is really showcasing some parts printed by Castillon out of niobium C103, it's difficult to see in this picture, but you'll see there is a small slot in the middle of this part. And many of these parts today are being developed with integrated features such as cooling channels. It is not possible to cast, machine, or forge these parts with these integrated channels. Additive manufacturing is, in fact, the only way to manufacture these parts. It also creates a much more quick and iterative design process, which enables us to get to serial production more quickly. Finally, on the very expensive materials such as C103, mind you, as we have disclosed with recent indicative pricing, C103 additive manufacturing powder sells for upwards of $3,000 US per kg, $4,500 Australian per kg, and much higher, partly depending on where the powder and the alloys are sourced from. In many machining applications, you've got what's called a buy-to-fly ratio of 40:1. That is, if you have a part that weighs 1 kg, you've got to buy 40 kg of C103 wrought material to subtract out or hollow out that part. For forgings, it's up to 15 times or 15:1 buy-to-fly ratio. In the case of additive manufacturing, we're well below 1.5 times, in some cases as little as 1.1 or 1.05 times, thus reducing the cost significantly of these expensive materials. Finally, let me touch on the planned capital investments and add a bit of color here. This is a page that we shared with an investor back in April, I believe it was. Simply updating, we provided prior guidance that estimated our fiscal year 24, 25, 26, that is that 3-year investment cycle. We'd estimated CapEx at 71 million, you see on the right. We've recently updated that estimate essentially the same. It went from 71.3 million to 71.5 million. We are very focused, and Jay Chandran and team have done a great job on this, of delaying the expenditures anywhere that we can. And you'll notice in fiscal year 24, we'd estimate about 18.6 million of expense. In fact, we brought in 11.2. We deferred much of that expense to this year, where we currently estimate $42.7 million. I would add, and this is important as one thinks about the capital needs that we will have over time, that $42.7 million is back-end loaded for this fiscal year, with fully 1/3 of those expenses coming in the 4th quarter of the fiscal year. Moreover, I would add that the institutional cornerstone investors that led our capital raise in March and April have continued to indicate strong support for the business, and we would expect that they would be supportive of capital raises going forward. Also, finally, we ended the year with about $12.2 million cash on the balance sheet. And so it's put the company in an enviable position to be somewhat flexible with when and how we choose to raise capital. We'll be very focused on the investors that we include in any capital raise, and very focused to minimize the dilution of existing shareholders in that capital raise. That is my final slide, Jane. I welcome to open it up to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Hank. And if we do have any questions for Hank, please use the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. Let me jump into them now. So we've got a question here just saying, just wondering why there's no minimum order threshold for the future.
Yeah, so what we have as opposed to a minimum order threshold, and this is quite common in the US marketplace, when you are supplying the Department of Defense, it is not permitted that you have a sole supplier given supply chain risk. And so it's quite common that one would have, quote unquote, a preferred supplier. And in the US, it would be commonplace to have a preferred supplier would receive a minimum of 75% of total demand for a company. What we have commented to investors heretofore is that our preferred supplier agreement has a percent of threshold demand higher than that. That is higher than what would be the typical of the 75% threshold. So albeit we do not have minimums as far as tonnage, we do have minimums as far as the percent of their total demand that they will be supplied from Amaero. And as I said in the commentary, we expect to be Adman and all of their subsidiary, including Castheon and CAM's primary supplier of C103 refractory and titanium alloys.
Thank you, Hank. So next one, can you please remind us of some of the other players who may be encouraged by this announcement to engage with Amaero, and would there be any restrictions as far as the relationship with Adman is concerned?
No, so very importantly, we negotiated this, and we've had other strategic engagement, if you will, where certain strategic parties have wanted to have certain restrictions, if you will, on our commercial capabilities, and we've not wanted to do that. Our admin relationship in no way restricts us from supplying other parties. They do have a most favored nation clause from a pricing standpoint, but in no way are we precluded, and we would expect to supply other first-tier suppliers in the space, as well as prime defense contractors directly in the space, as well as, of course, DoD labs for development alloy purposes, as we've alluded to in the past.
Thank you, Hank. Next one is, can you give us a brief update of how the key work programs are progressing at the Amaero facility, and what is the next assignment for Atomizer 1, and when is Atomizer 2 expected to arrive in the US?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So we've approached the construction in 3 phases. The first phase, which was a real focus, was to get the production area for the first atomizer finished, right? So we could begin production, produce powder, get that powder to our counterparty for qualification and get to where we are today, and now begin to ramp up production for commercial purposes. We'll also begin to ramp up production where we can provide powder samples to other customers where they also will qualify. Given how well respected Adman, Castheon, and CAM are, and given the engagement they already have with other DoD labs as well as defense primes, we expect this will accelerate the acceptance of our powder and the qualification processes. And so that was the reason to, again, prioritize production area number 1. Phase number 2 is production area number 2, as well as the IPP manufacturing area. The IPP manufacturing area, we haven't commented on this much. I would add that if there's an area that's been a positive surprise from a demand pull standpoint, it is IPP. Many are probably well aware of the significant demands of the submarine industrial base and how much we've got to increase our manufacturing capability. And we've seen a lot of interest in our team's, long and well-established experience in this area. So phase number 2 will be the production area for the second atomizer. The second atomizer is expected to be finished and shipped in February. We expect to land that in about March, and we expect to commission that about the same time next year that we did the first atomizer this year. So think of at the end of the fiscal year, we would expect to commission the second atomizer. And then phase number 3 are the corporate offices. In phase 1, we had our laboratory. The laboratory area, part of that we're currently using for corporate offices. And then we will move our corporate offices into our permanent facility, if you will, which will be finished sometime late 3rd quarter of the fiscal year or into even the 4th quarter, probably even more likely the 4th quarter of the fiscal year is when we'll finish the corporate offices. And that will be a total completion of the facility. We'll continue to have room to expand certain areas, but the facility at that point in time will be completed.
Thank you, Hank. Bear with me. I'm jumping around a little bit here. There's quite a few coming through. So next one, does the company expect qualification will accelerate possible US Department of Defense funding grants? Deb?
Yes and yes. It's hard to overstate how consequential qualifying is, and particularly with this counterparty. To have qualified C103 in the timeline that we did, many on this call are well familiar with mining and what it's like to qualify materials. To qualify this in less than 6 months from when we announced this, to qualify this in July, less than 3 months, or about 3 to 4 months from when we commissioned the atomizer, right? This is a remarkable achievement, and it really shows the experience of our technical team and our operating team. Eric Bono, Jay Chandran, the entire team just did a fantastic job. It also speaks to our collaborative relationship with ADMAN, and we are well aligned. And of course, it is in their best interest and our best interest to do everything that we can do to accelerate insertion of additive manufacturing. And that really speaks to the question. So yes, we think it will advance US non-dilutive funding opportunities for us. And yes, we think it will advance other offtake and commercial agreements for us.
Wonderful. There's 2 parts to this one. So how many atomizers is Amaero planning to install? And what is the production capacity of one atomizer?
Yep. So we've talked about this at some length in the past. Each atomizer has total production capacity of 200 tons of powder. But more importantly, the yield of our technology, about 50% of that production is the highest value, what we call powder bed fusion yield, so about 100 tons. By comparison, our competitor has a last generation IGA, and they only have a 25% yield. So both of us have 200 tons of powder, but we get 100 tons of additive manufacturing powder. They only have 50 tons. Thus, we make the statement that we're positioned to be the largest in capacity today, right? We're twice the capacity of this competitor and much more responsive. We can provide powder in months, not years, right? We've also announced to the market over time, we plan for 4 atomizers. Further, we've said we've already ordered the second. That was announced late last calendar year. So about 9 months ago, we ordered the second atomizer. We've announced plans to order a third atomizer before the end of the calendar year. And then we plan to order a fourth one, but we've given no further guidance on that at this point in time. So across 4 atomizers, it'd be 800 tons, 400 tons of powder bed fusion for each atomizer, 200 tons, 100 tons of powder bed fusion.
Wonderful. Another one that's popped up. So has there been any communication with potential customers outside of the US?
Yes and no. Keep in mind, one of the interesting things about our opportunity is the nature of C103 and the nature of the defense components themselves, be it hypersonics or strategic missiles, is highly export controlled. So the powder needs to be purchased from a US domestic supplier, of which there are 2, and there will be limits on our export ability with the powder. So as it relates to C103, we would expect to only, it's likely we will only be selling to US companies. They would manufacture those end parts. Those end parts may well be exported, right, outside the US, particularly to US allies. The exception to that could be the space program. So in the space program, again, for thermal protection and propulsion systems, where you might have leading edges, thrusters, nozzles, etc., there could well be some space primes and some space suppliers that we could export to over time. But think of C103 as primarily a US domestic opportunity. Titanium, on the other hand, will be a much more what I would call US and US ally Western Europe opportunity. Titanium is selling into the broader aerospace market, not just defense, and the broader medical market. Think about hip replacements and things such as that. So here you've got Western European medical device companies as well as US companies.
Thank you, Hank. Again, this one's got 2 parts to it. So can you elaborate on the plans for the first atomizer's capacity beyond the ADMAN offtake? And are you currently selling unqualified powder at this point in time?
Yeah, so we will, as it relates to C103, we will do some work with how do I want to say this? We will do some work with some DO-funded labs, and we will begin to do some work with some defense primes, as well as some other tier 1 suppliers, each of which would buy powder for testing purposes and subsequently qualify the powder. And so we certainly would expect that going into fiscal year 25. That is we said we'd begin to commercialize the second half of fiscal year 25. There are some analysts who have done some, I think, really thoughtful research, both at Curran & Co. and at Shaw & Partners. And albeit they have not seen our internal planning models and we have not shared those internal planning models with investors, I have reviewed their models closely. You'll notice they're quite conservative with their demand expectations in fiscal year 25 and in fiscal year 26. And I think that's appropriate. So there's nothing that I see in the assumptions that they've made that I would say is materially different than what we are conservatively planning for internally.
Thank you, Hank. Bear with me. Sorry, I'm just going through them all. Okay, so is the first atomizer solely for C103 production?
No, and nor do we think it ever will be. As I said, long term, we expect the demand for C103 at about 120, maybe it's 140 tons a year. Today, there's only 2 suppliers. What we have internally assumed to be conservative is eventually there will be 3 suppliers. And so we've assumed long term that we will have about 35% market share. So, albeit we haven't provided our terminal production demand numbers, if you take 35% of that, you get to 40, 45 tons. That's probably a fair estimate. And yet I said we've got about 100 tons of AM powder, right, for one atomizer. So the way that I would think about the first atomizer once we get to terminal demand is it'll be about half C103 and about half high-value specialty, with atomizer 2, 3, and 4 dedicated to titanium. Now, the benefit of that is if other specialty opportunities come about, and we think there's a likelihood they will, we could quickly repurpose one of those atomizers to a higher value specialty other than titanium. But we're kind of planning for that conservative scenario. That being said, in fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26, the first atomizer will produce C103 specialty and titanium as we ramp up the demand pull of C103.
Wonderful. I think that covers all the questions that have come through. I think just finally, and you did touch on this in your presentation, but perhaps if you can just reiterate what investors should be looking forward to from a news flow perspective over the next 3 to 6 months.
I think importantly, and again, I give incredible credit to the operating team. I truly believe we have the most experienced and the best technical and manufacturing powder production operating team in the country, coupled with the most advanced technology in the IGA premium, and the only technology capable of qualifying and producing C103 at scale. This is a big deal. And off of that, if you look at the reshoring theme that we're in today and this big thematic opportunity, again, no hyperbole, a once-in-a-generation type investment opportunity, I think Amaero is uniquely positioned. What we will continue to do is try to communicate in a balanced and very transparent manner. We'll try to continue to communicate in a manner that we are highly confident that we can exceed the expectations of investors, that we underpromise and that we overdeliver. I think we've established a track record of doing so, and it's very important to us that we continue to do so. And finally, I would just add, and I won't call out by name, but we have a small number of institutional investors who have been very supportive. It's a big deal for a company like Amaero. And moreover, the top 50 shareholders, I believe 11 are nominee. Of the other 39, I've probably personally gotten to know 30 of those high net worth investors. We've got a group of very supportive high net worth investors. This has been a significant 2-year restructuring. The restructuring is done. The technical risk is behind us. And now we move on to the commercial opportunity. And I think Amaero has a very unique opportunity and a chance in a small way to really make a difference in the U.S. industrial base and supply chain, particularly for defense and space. And we're excited to continue to deliver upon that.
Wonderful. Well, I think that covers all the questions for today. If we have missed anything, please feel free to reach out by the contact details, which can be found at the bottom of our ASX releases. And a copy of today's recording will be available online shortly as well. But thank you all for your time.
Many thanks, Jane. Thank you.